Let's take a look at a sample essay for essay number 2. This is an essay that a student wrote in my class several semesters ago, and of course I've taken the name off. We're not going to go through every single part of the essay. If you want to read the whole essay, I will post it within the page on Canvas. I want to focus on some key points. I want to focus on the thesis statement, topic sentences, and the use of point-by-point format, because this student does all of those things pretty well. Notice that the student begins with a hook, something that's supposed to pull the reader in, and it's a quote. But we need to know who this Suzuki person is. So it would be good if this person, using commas, gave us a little bit of information, right? Just a couple of words of information about who Suzuki is, so we know why that person is an authority or just who that person is. I also like how the person includes a transition from the hook, that quotation about your attitude, into the thesis about Raymond Carver's cathedral. So of course you have to have some sort of transitional phrase or logical connection between the hook and the thesis, which she does. The period has to go inside the punctuation marks if there is no parenthetical citation. It should go outside the parentheses if there is a parenthetical citation. If that's kind of confusing or if you've forgotten some of those rules, go back to my video lecture on quotation integration. Let's focus on the thesis. So the thesis is at the end of the intro paragraph. Remember, the end of the intro or somewhere near the end of the intro is a good place to put your thesis. The two characters are different in many ways and seem incompatible on the surface. Robert is an optimist, the narrator is a pessimist. They interact with the narrator's wife very differently and speak uniquely, but they end up forming an unlikely bond and showcase that even people with contrasting personalities have something to learn from one another. So this thesis is pretty solid. There are a few things this person could improve, but the thesis has the key components that you need to have for this essay. So the thesis mentions both characters, right? If you are writing about cathedral, you would need to mention Robert and the narrator. Remember, the narrator doesn't have a name, so it's okay to just say the narrator. If you were writing about the werewolf, you would need to say the girl and the grandmother. Those characters don't have names either. If you were writing about the color of love, you would say Senna or the narrator and her grandmother. And if you were writing about the very old man with enormous wings or a very old man with enormous wings, you would need to include Father Gonzaga and the old man. A lot of the characters in the stories that we're reading actually remain nameless, which is kind of interesting. So it includes both of the characters' names, and it also includes a list of the points that she is going to compare and contrast in the essay. That's really important for point-by-point structure, right? This type of structure is very precise and pretty nitpicky. One thing that this person could do to make the thesis better, though, is to use parallel structure. That means that each part of the list should follow the same structure grammatically. And also notice that the first part of the list, the part I've circled here, Robert is an optimist, the narrator is a pessimist. That's really one point, right? Their outlook on life, and yet she's breaking it down into both characters. Since the rest of this just focuses on the overarching point of both characters, it would be better if that first point were boiled down to one, right? Saying something like their outlook, rather than saying Robert is an optimist, the narrator is a pessimist. You just want to make sure that whenever you're listing, the structure of your list and also just the content of your list follows the same structure so that when you're reading it, it flows really nicely. So this person is listing the points of comparison and contrast, but she's going beyond that, right? If you just list the specific points that you're going to be talking about in the essay, you're not really making a debatable claim. Your thesis is not very analytical. So one of the things I'm requiring for this essay is that you include a so what, that you include the thematic significance of comparing and contrasting, or you include what comparing and contrasting these two characters teaches us, or how can we view the story differently in light of comparing and contrasting the two characters. So you have to add after or before your list of points, you have to add the so what. And ideally that will be something debatable or analytical. It'll connect to a theme, right? It will illuminate something about the story, because we're not just comparing and contrasting for the sake of it. We're comparing and contrasting characters to try to understand something. So this person includes that, but they end up forming an unlikely bond and showcase that even people with contrasting personalities have something to learn from one another. So there is a so what that's included, although I would say it's not incredibly debatable, right? A lot of us would read the story and have the same takeaway. So this could go a little bit deeper. We could get to a kind of underlying thematic message that's not so obvious, but she does have all the components that you need. Both characters, the name of the story. She mentions the name of the story earlier. That's fine. It doesn't have to be in your thesis itself as long as you mention it in the intro. The points of comparison and contrast and a so what. But that so what that she's included could be a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more debatable. If you look at the first topic sentence, you'll see that she's following the instructions. She has both characters and the point that she's going to be comparing and contrasting. Robert and the narrator vary the most in their outlooks on life. Now, that's not an incredibly complex topic sentence. Your topic sentence could be more complex, but it gets the job done. Both characters and the point, right? Their outlook. How Robert is an optimist and the narrator is a pessimist, but boiled down to outlook. Then notice that the first part of body paragraph 1 is about Robert's outlook, and the second part of body paragraph 1 is about the narrator's outlook. She has one quote for Robert and one quote for the narrator, right? That's really important. So I really like these quotes that she's chosen, and for the most part, she is integrating her quotes correctly, although this first quote right here, that's a quote inside of a quotation. So we have a quote from Carver, a quote from the story, but we have Carver using dialogue. Robert is speaking here. So it's a quote inside of a quote. In that case, you have to use quote within a quote format. So you use double quotes because you're quoting the story, but you're quoting what a character says. So you have a single quote as well. Other than that, though, good quotation integration. Notice that she has about the same amount of analysis as quotation. So she has about 3 short sentences of analysis, and then she has about 3 lines of quotation. Ideally, you should have more analysis than quotation. So it's always okay to pick a short quote. You can even pick one really rich or symbolic or figurative quote or word than to have a lot of quote and just a little analysis. So this requires a little more analysis, at least a sentence or two. I think there's more to say about the fact that he's asking, Robert is asking the narrator a question. It says something about his outlook or his want to connect with people. I think there's a lot to say about the TV and how he has an old relic, a black and white TV and a colored TV. There's more to be said about his sense of humor. Even though the quote seems very straightforward, I think there's still more to unpack that connects back to the topic sentence about both characters' outlook on life. Ideally, you will include a transition between your discussion of the first character and your discussion of the second character. That's why I've included trans here. She needs some sort of transitional word or transitional phrase. Same thing with the second quote. We have a really good quote for the narrator that tells us about the narrator's kind of negative outlook on life or his pessimism. And there's some analysis. There's good analysis here, but there's about the same amount of analysis as quotation. There's still more to be said. The fact that he shrugs, the fact that he is being gazed at, right? Throughout the story, he is looking and making judgments about Robert, who is blind. But here, his wife is the one looking at him, and she doesn't like what she sees. There's a lot to unpack there, so even more analysis. The rest of the essay follows point-by-point structure really nicely, so you can see, I'm not going to go through all of this here, but you can see how this topic sentence is effective. Robert and the narrator also vary on how they choose to express themselves through language, so that's a point that's not incredibly obvious, right? An incredibly obvious point about Robert and the narrator would be that one can see and one is blind, although metaphorically you could say that the opposite is true. These are points that are more insightful than that. I like how she's looking for points of comparison and contrast that the casual reader just reading the story once through might not notice. So she's going a little bit deeper there. And she has quotes for both characters. Since she started, she established the precedent in body paragraph 1 of Robert first, followed by the narrator. She's keeping up that pattern in the whole essay, which is good. Lots of good analysis. She could use even more analysis. Of course, there are some sentences that are using the same structure over and over again, so this could benefit from sentence variety and transitions. But the essay is actually picking up steam here. The analysis is getting more sophisticated. I want to just kind of skip down to the end. One thing I liked about this essay is that the student, at least it appears to me, She spent some time thinking about the order of the points. So ideally, you're not just discussing outlook on life first and marriage is last just because that's the order that you thought of the points in. Ideally, you've come up with your points of comparison and contrast and you're arranging them in some sort of order that makes sense. So you could use chronological order if you wanted to, but I always like emphatic order. That means you save your most powerful or sophisticated or surprising example for last. And I think she does that. She focuses on vision, not just the literal vision, right, which is the obvious point, but she focuses on this idea of vision and insight. And she saves that for last because maybe it connects the most to one of the bigger themes of the text. So I like how she uses emphatic order. I also appreciated how the conclusion is not just summarizing. In college level essays, we've moved beyond just summarizing what we've already said. There's one sentence that echoes the thesis, but we also want to end with memorable closing words, a prediction, a recommendation, connecting the text to what a scholar has to say about the text, connecting it to a real world or real life issue. There are all sorts of strategies earlier in the module if you're looking for some ideas for how to conclude your essay without just summarizing what you've already said. This is a good opportunity for me to remind you in your works cited page not to forget to use a hanging indent. Remember, with MLA format, as irritating as it can be, you need to indent not the first line of the citation, but the subsequent line. So you can see that she's done she's almost done it right. She doesn't indent the first line, which is correct. This second line right here should be indented so it lines up with Diani. And then, of course, titles of long works like books should be put in italics. Short works like the short story title Cathedral should be in quotation marks. So this is a textbook, so this should be included in italics. And if you're only citing one work, and most of you for this essay will just be citing that one short story, unless, of course, you've done additional research, it'll just say work cited. If you have multiple works, it will say works cited. And she does use MLA format, her name, my name, the class, and the date, a title, and a page number and her last name on the upper right-hand side. So I hope that helps. If you want to read the whole essay, just click below.